My family stranded me on a remote tropical island to carry out a corporate coup and steal my firm. They paid off the resort staff, cut the satellite arrays, and left me completely off the grid while they boarded a private charter back to New York. They thought a 48-hour communication blackout was enough to trigger the emergency incapacity clause in our corporate charter and strip me of my 12 years of equity. But there is a fundamental flaw when amateurs try to play a professional's game. They forgot that as regional manager, I didn't just run the logistics. I knew every hidden back door, every ghost vendor, and every cent they had been embezzling for a decade. They thought they left me in a luxury prison, completely blind to the fact that they were flying straight into a trap I had been waiting years to spring. The sound of twin-turbine helicopter blades cutting through heavy tropical humidity is a very specific frequency. It is loud enough to drown out the sound of a family tie breaking and quiet enough to mask the sound of a corporate execution. That was the last thing I heard before the corporate charter lifted off from the private helipad of the St. Jude Resort, leaving me standing on a patch of wet concrete 60 miles off the coast of the mainland. Through the tinted plexiglass of the ascending cockpit, I didn't see panic. I didn't see my stepmother, Victoria, looking down with regret, nor did I see my stepbrother, Julian, checking his conscience. I saw Julian holding up his glass of scotch, a silent toast to an empty runway, while Victoria adjusted her silk scarf and looked straight ahead toward the corporate headquarters in New York. Seconds later, the resort's secondary power grid hummed, and the cellular signal bars on my phone dropped from 5 to an absolute hollow 0. When I walked into the marble lobby to demand a satellite landline, the concierge wouldn't look me in the eye. He simply pushed a laminated card across the desk stating that due to an unexpected regional data corruption, the entire island was under a mandatory 48-hour communication quarantine. No outbound data, no maritime shuttles, no entry or exit. Most regional managers would have panicked. Most people who had spent 12 years building a $1 million logistics and distribution empire from the concrete floors up would have screamed at the staff, demanded a boat, or broken a window. But I didn't panic. I calculated I am Peter Vance. For over a decade, my job has been to run the entire Eastern Seaboard distribution network for Vance Global Logistics. My daily routine is to look at thousands of moving parts, freight manifests, fuel margins, and supply chain bottlenecks, and find the single variable that is slowing down the machine. So as I sat down on a teak bench in that silent lobby, listening to the tropical rain begin to hammer against the glass, I didn't treat this like a family betrayal. I treated my situation like a forensic balance sheet. Item 1. My stepmother took my corporate laptop from the villa while I was checking the morning inventory logs. Item 2. My stepbrother explicitly paid the resort manager a $10,000 cash premium under the guise of an exclusive facility maintenance fee to ensure the satellite array was disconnected the exact moment their helicopter cleared the airspace. Item 3. The timing was not random. It was the third Tuesday of the fiscal quarter. The realization didn't hit me with emotional weight, it hit me with the cold clarity of a data stream. The emergency board meeting was scheduled for Thursday morning at 9 o'clock. In the fine print of the Vance Global Logistics corporate charter, there is a very specific, highly predatory legal mechanism known as the Emergency Incapacity Clause. It was drafted by my late father to protect the company in the event a high-level executive went missing or was taken hostage during international trade negotiations. The clause stated that if a regional managing partner with voting equity failed to check into the central secure server or remained contactable for 48 consecutive hours during a critical structural restructure, their administrative voting rights were temporarily suspended. Control of their entire regional block would automatically default to the Central Executive Committee. Victoria and Julian didn't want to just fire me. Firing me required cause, a compliance review, and a severance negotiation that would expose the company's internal ledger to outside eyes. They needed me to vanish just long enough for the clock to run out. If I was silent for 48 hours, the clause would trigger automatically. By the time the communication quarantine lifted on this island, the board would have already voted by a simple majority to absorb my entire regional network, stripping me of my 12 years of equity for pennies on the dollar. It was legally airtight, beautifully malicious, and completely ruthless. They thought they had left me in a luxury prison while they flew back to first-class victory. But there is a fundamental flaw. When amateurs try to play a professional's game, they look at the board and only see their own pieces. They don't look at the perimeter. 20 minutes into the blackout, I walked out of the resort lobby, bypassed the manicured trails, and headed directly to the northern ridge of the island overlooking the deep-water shipping lanes. Through the sheets of tropical rain, out past the coral reef, there was a shadow on the water that wasn't there during the morning briefing. It was a 180-foot matte black expedition yacht named the Obsidian. It didn't belong to a tourist, and it didn't belong to the resort. It belonged to Christian Thorne. Christian Thorne was a name whispered in boardroom corridors like a corporate ghost story. He was a high-level corporate liquidator and hostile takeover specialist backed by $50 billion in institutional capital. He was the man sovereign funds called when an international conglomerate was rotting from the inside and needed to be carved up with surgical precision. He didn't visit the Caribbean for vacation. He visited because he was circling a target. I didn't wait for a miracle. I used the resort's emergency solar-powered maritime flare kit, a manual signaling system that doesn't rely on software or satellite links, 3 long bursts of high-intensity crimson light toward the coordinates of the yacht. 10 minutes later, a heavy-duty Zodiac boat cut through the surf, manned by 2 silent operators in black tactical gear. They didn't ask for my passport. They simply told me that Mr. Thorne was expecting me. As I climbed the steel boarding ladder of the Obsidian, the air transitioned from humid salt to the crisp, freezing air conditioning of a high-tech war room. Christian Thorne didn't offer a handshake or a towel. He stood behind a massive mahogany table covered in triple monitor arrays displaying live maritime tracking data. He looked at me with the eyes of a man who didn't view people as human beings, but as assets to be either liquidated or leveraged. He spoke with a low, gravelly authority, stating my full name, my tenure at the company, and the exact volume of freight my region moved annually. He noted that I was supposed to be trapped in a black box for another 46 hours and expressed a dark amusement that I had found a way out so quickly. I told him that my family had just triggered the emergency incapacity clause. Christian Thorne didn't show sympathy. He simply smiled, a sharp, mechanical movement of his jaw that indicated he had just found the missing variable in his own calculations. He explained his presence in the region. For 6 months, his fund had been quietly buying up the secondary debt of Vance Global Logistics, aiming for a total hostile takeover. He held 40% of the company's liabilities, but he was missing the critical lever. To force a total liquidation and seize the board, he needed proof of systemic internal fraud at the executive level. His regular high-priced forensic auditors had spent months digging through the corporate filings in New York, but they kept hitting a brick wall. The executives were too clever. They kept their high-level spreadsheets perfectly clean. That was when I looked at his monitors and realized why his team had failed. They were looking at the top of the mountain, while the gold was buried in the valley. I told Thorne that his auditors were blind because they didn't understand ground-level operations. Executives don't hide stolen money in the main corporate bank accounts. They hide it in the operational friction. They hide it in the freight manifests, the regional fuel surcharges, and the third-party logistics vendors. I told him that I had run the Eastern Seaboard for 12 years. I knew every single supplier, every ghost route, and every inflated invoice. I told him that if he got me back to New York before the 48-hour clock expired, I wouldn't just give him a case for a hostile takeover. I would hand him the evidence to put my family in a federal penitentiary. Thorne didn't hesitate. He tapped his screen, authorizing an immediate flight plan for his private Global Express jet waiting at the mainland terminal, and ordered his security team to provide me with the fully encrypted, unmonitored corporate network link. This was not a rescue mission. It was a joint venture. We were 2 predators closing in on the same prey from opposite sides of the woods. Inside the quiet cabin of Thorne's private jet, flying at 41,000 feet over the Atlantic, I opened the encrypted laptop his team provided. I didn't open my personal accounts or my corporate email. Those were undoubtedly monitored by Victoria's IT security team waiting to log any IP address that would prove I was active. Instead, I bypassed the standard login portals completely. Every veteran regional manager who actually builds a network leaves a back door. Years ago, during a massive union strike that threatened to lock out our regional servers, I hard-coded a secondary administrative emergency override directly into the regional distribution database. It was routed through an obsolete, low-bandwidth inventory port used for old handheld warehouse scanners. It didn't register as a standard user login. It looked like a routine automated system ping from a warehouse in Savannah, Georgia. The moment I breached the system, I saw the digital footprints of their panic. Julian had been incredibly busy. While I was supposed to be counting waves on the beach, my stepbrother was using his temporary executive access to run an unaudited cleanup script through the regional database. I pulled up the historical ledger for a company called Apex Logistics. To an outside auditor, Apex looked like a standard, mid-sized third-party trucking vendor that Vance Global used to handle overflow freight during peak seasons. They had been on our payroll for 7 years, receiving steady monthly payments ranging from $80,000 to $120,000. But as I cross-referenced the Apex Logistics invoice numbers with the physical regional gate logs that I had saved to my private local drive months ago, the fraud became mathematically undeniable. The trucks listed on the Apex invoices didn't exist. The license plates didn't match our automated freight scanners. The container numbers were fabricated out of thin air. Julian wasn't just a bad executive, he was an amateur embezzler. He had been using Apex Logistics as a personal shell company for nearly a decade, quietly skimming over $9 million from the company's operational budget to fund his private lifestyle and cover massive personal trading losses. He had kept the scheme small enough to hide under the massive volume of my region's profits. Because my distribution centers were running at an unprecedented 98% efficiency, the company was making so much money that nobody noticed a $100,000 monthly leak in the freight department. But now that they were moving to freeze me out and sell the company to an offshore buyer, Julian realized that an independent corporate audit was inevitable. If an outside firm looked at the regional gate logs, his shell game was over. He needed to wipe Apex Logistics from the system before the board meeting on Thursday morning. I looked across the cabin at Christian Thorne, who was sipping an espresso while reviewing court-ordered receivership templates. I told him that my brother was currently in the system, actively trying to delete 7 years of fraudulent invoices. Thorne raised an eyebrow and asked if we should block his access immediately to preserve the data. I smiled and told him no. When your enemy's running toward a cliff, you don't build a wall, you build a ramp. Instead of locking Julian out, I used my administrative override to create a mirrored live sync clone of the regional server. It was a digital honeypot. To Julian's computer at headquarters, it looked like he was successfully deleting the original master files from the central database. The progress bars on his screen would show 100% completion. But in reality, my script was rerouting every single command he executed. The original invoices were being safely archived into an encrypted external server controlled directly by Christian Thorne's legal team, while a live keystroke recorder captured the exact digital signature, IP address, and security badge credentials of the computer Julian was using at headquarters. We didn't just let him delete the files, we accelerated the process. Using Thorne's high-speed server architecture, I sent an automated system-wide critical security alert to Julian's executive console. The alert read, "System-wide regional integrity audit scheduled to commence automatically in 60 minutes. All unverified third-party vendor profiles will be permanently frozen for manual compliance review." The bait was perfect. I watched the live server telemetry as Julian's data activity spiked into a state of absolute frenzy. He didn't just continue deleting files, he panicked. He began rushing through the database, mass purging every document, every email correspondence, and every wire transfer authorization associated with Apex Logistics. In his mind, he was beating the clock, scrubbing the crime scene clean before the automated audit could catch him. In reality, with every single click of his mouse, he was generating a pristine, legally undeniable record of intent, destruction of corporate data, and obstruction of justice. He wasn't cleaning his hands, he was pressing his fingerprints deeper into the murder weapon. We landed at a private airfield outside Manhattan at 6 o'clock on Thursday morning. The city below was covered in a cold, gray dawn mist, a sharp contrast to the tropical heat of the island I had been stranded on less than 24 hours prior. Christian Thorne's team had been working through the night. The legal documents were already printed, bound in heavy black leather folders, and signed by a federal magistrate who had been awakened at 3 in the morning by Thorne's high-powered legal counsel. We didn't need a lengthy court battle. We had a smoking gun that was still warm. As we rode in the back of a black armored sedan toward the Vance Global Logistics high-rise in Midtown, I looked out at the city streets. My family truly believed they had won. They believed I was currently sitting on a remote beach, completely cut off from the world, watching the sun rise with a useless piece of plastic in my pocket. They had already drafted the press release announcing my sudden, unexpected medical leave due to executive burnout. They had already prepared the board resolutions to restructure the company and transfer the regional equity into their central accounts. They had spent weeks planning my professional execution, completely blind to the fact that they had spent the last 12 hours building their own gallows. When the elevator doors opened on the executive floor at exactly 8:45, 15 minutes before the mandatory board meeting was set to begin, the floor was silent. The glass-walled corridors smelled of expensive floor wax and stale espresso. I walked past the receptionist, who gasped and dropped her tablet as if she had just seen a ghost walk through the security scanners. I didn't stop to explain. I didn't look at my old office. I walked directly toward the double mahogany doors of the main boardroom, flanked by Christian Thorne and 2 plainclothes federal compliance investigators from the Southern District of New York. Through the frosted glass of the boardroom, I could see them. Victoria was sitting at the head of the long marble table, an elegant fountain pen in her hand, looking over the final restructuring documents. Julian was standing by the window, pouring a glass of champagne, his face relaxed, wearing the arrogant smile of an unearned victor. They were celebrating a corporate funeral before the body was even cold. I pushed the double doors open. The heavy wood slammed against the interior walls with a sound like a gunshot. Julian's champagne glass shattered against the edge of the marble table, spilling sparkling liquid across the pristine white documents. Victoria froze, her fountain pen stopping mid-stroke, her face instantly draining of color until her skin matched the sterile white of her pearl necklace. For 5 seconds, the room was completely dead, devoid of sound except for the hum of the HVAC system. Julian tried to recover first. He stepped forward, his voice shaking with a pathetic attempt at executive authority, stammering that I was supposed to be unavailable, that I had abandoned my post, and that under the emergency incapacity clause, the board had already moved to terminate my position for operational neglect. He pointed a trembling finger at the door, screaming that I was an outsider who no longer held any voting equity in this room. I didn't yell. I didn't show anger. I walked to the center of the room, pulled out the high-backed leather chair directly across from my stepmother, and sat down. I tapped the screen of my tablet, and the massive 80-inch presentation monitor on the boardroom wall flared to life. Instead of the corporate logo or the quarterly financial slides, the screen displayed a live, high-definition split-screen matrix. On the left side was a scrolling, chronological ledger of every single dollar ever paid to Apex Logistics over a 7-year period, complete with the real physical gate logs proving no trucks had ever moved. On the right side was the digital forensic log captured during the night, a crystal-clear recording of Julian's exact corporate user profile operating from his private home IP address, systematically executing commands to delete those exact files. Before Victoria could even close her mouth, Christian Thorne stepped into the frame. He dropped the heavy black leather files onto the center of the marble table with a resounding thud. He spoke with the cold, bored tone of a judge delivering a predetermined sentence, stating that his fund had officially assumed control of 60% of the company's outstanding institutional liabilities as of 5 minutes ago. He informed them that a federal magistrate had already signed an emergency asset freeze and receivership order based on clear evidence of multi-million-dollar corporate embezzlement, wire fraud, and grand larceny. Julian collapsed backward against the window frame, his eyes wide with horror as he stared at the keystroke logs on the screen. He realized that his desperate scramble during the night hadn't saved him. It had provided the state with a flawless, self-signed confession. Victoria slowly let the fountain pen drop from her fingers, her hands trembling as she looked from the screen to Christian Thorne, and finally to me. She realized that the luxury prison she had bought for me on that island had been nothing more than the staging ground for her own destruction. I leaned forward across the table, looking directly into the eyes of the people who had tried to discard 12 years of my life for a quick payout. I delivered the final calculated balance sheet. "You thought you were deleting my career," I said, my voice completely flat, resonating through the silent room. "Turns out you were signing your own eviction notice. Take them out." The sound of handcuffs clicking in a high-rise boardroom is remarkably quiet. There was no theatrical screaming, no dramatic shouting matches, no familial pleas for mercy. There were only the heavy, systematic footsteps of the federal compliance officers leading Victoria and Julian out through the glass corridors, their heads bowed, past a crowd of the silent, staring employees. They had spent years treating the company like a private ATM and treating me like disposable operational labor, completely blind to the fact that the labor is what kept the roof over their heads. 3 weeks later, the transition was complete. Under the emergency receivership guidelines, Christian Thorne's funds successfully restricted Vance Global Logistics, dissolving the old executive board entirely. The offshore sale was permanently blocked. The embezzled funds were legally assessed for asset recovery, and the central corporate registry was wiped clean of the rot that had threatened to destroy it. I signed the final organizational charter from my new corner office on the top floor, looking out over the gray expanse of the Manhattan skyline. Christian Thorne stood by the door, adjusting his coat, a silent nod of the mutual professional respect passing between us before he left to pursue his next target. There was no family drama left to resolve, no lingering bitterness, no regrets. They always told me that blood was thicker than water, but they forgot that a professional ledger doesn't care about blood. It only cares about the balance. And as I closed the file and turned off the monitor, the balance was absolutely perfect.